This is a sequence that we shot about 13 months after principal photography, and we were really worried about it because Jake had grown about 4 inches. But I think we were just able to pull it off. You don't really see the difference too much in how much he had grown.
In the original script, didn't have this scene, but I really wanted to get a sense of Anakin's future, and Anakin's dreams, and where he expected to go. And I thought I needed this little introspective moment. The plot device in this is that he has to get the blood sample in order to figure out the midichlorian count. But before we did it in a garage. But I took it out of the garage, rewrote it, and put it on the balcony at night so we could talk about the stars and going to the stars and that sort of thing. Midichlorians into it as a device is something that existed from the beginning, but I never really had the time to go into any explanation, because every time these rather larger concepts come into play, how does the galaxy work, what is the Force, all this kind of stuff, you have to be very sort of cryptic and deal in almost fortune cookie descriptions of things, and so it's very difficult to get a concept across. But I figured in this whole movie I could begin to bring out the idea of midichlorians and their job in being sensitive to the Force, and why some people are more susceptible to the Force than others, which is an issue that's in the first film, but you never know why some people have the Force is strong with some people and not strong with other people. What is the device that causes that to happen? And I also like the idea of this symbiotic relationships, which is, and again, an ongoing theme in the whole movie of people helping people, that there may be a completely different race of life form that lives inside your body, completely independent of you, but has some influence over you.
This is all actually shot during the daytime. Originally this took place at sunset, but George decided to make it early evening. Our big pod race arena shots. A few people in the background, as well as a lot of blue screen extras in the foreground. CG are all over the place here.
We have the obvious Watto, Jar Jar, and Sebulba, but though, of course, if you look in the background, we've got a lot of droids. And then we'll go in the reverse of this angle. We've got big creatures in the background. We've got Rontos and Dewbacks.
In this direction are a miniature. The views in this direction are of a section of the set that we had full size. That one wall. This direction are all the miniature. There's actually a split. The part of the set that's on the right-hand side of frame is the live-action set, and the part on the left is a miniature. Those are lots of blue screen elements of individual people added in to make it busy.
With this animation on Watto, a lot of this was done by Steve Rollins, a great character animator here. And Tim Harrington, Linda Bell, Sue Campbell, they all did a fantastic job in this section. Work is because of the follow-through of the skin underneath his chin, I think, and the way his trunk moves, that you have a feeling of that head snapping around, but there's a follow-through of what we call in animation, a secondary movement. As animators, that doesn't naturally happen inside the computer, though, so you have to be thinking about that when you're making that character move.
Coming up here of Padme on the Eope, and it's this one right here that was shot a year after principal photography. Actually, the really remarkable difference is that that's Jake a year later as well. So when you're 8 years old, a year makes a big difference in your look.
This was a fun shot because we made it up. It had no pan in the original shot. You didn't pan over to R2 and 3PO. But we were able to create that digitally, take a regular shot and just move it and turn it into a pan, and then add the part with 3PO and R2. Just the beginnings of learning how to create really 3D worlds using 2D images, where you shot something but you want to continue it, but you didn't do it because it wasn't there.
And was added there later. Padre Stadium, there's everything in this shot. It's a big miniature. All of the pods are in there, so all 18 of them. There's computer-generated people out on the ground going up and down the steps. There's creatures everywhere.
The original cut of this grid sequence was quite long. We just kept cutting it down and down because it sort of got out of proportion with the rest of the movie and the rest of the pod race. I mean, it was cute and we loved it, but we were afraid that an audience would get bored with it. When I saw it went through the outtakes for the DVD, decided to put it back in the movie, or at least parts of it. You'll notice that on the outtakes on the DVD, it's actually longer than it is here, even though we've added a few sequences back in. The thing about a DVD is you can actually focus more on the movie than you focus on the first few weeks of the film being released. Because you're always concerned that when the movie goes out there, people are going to be bored, they're not going to like it, and as a result it doesn't work and you lose everything. And that clouds your mind to keeping in a lot of little fun things that you like yourself, but you don't know whether they're extra length in the film, which risks the quality of the whole movie, or at least the success of the whole movie.
It's an especially difficult one to execute because of all the rig removal that had to take place underneath the pods. Those full-size pods were all supported on pipe rigs. They had to be painted out in all of the shots.
One of the great things about these really wide shots where you see the audiences, all the background players weren't people actually. They were Q-tips that were painted with little people's faces on them. It was a great idea that came up through the model shop at ILM, and I think it really was effective in showing how many people were in the arena.
You can notice the simulations happening on his, what we call his whiskers, though, as they move around. It really helps with the weight of the character and the feeling of it being a real creature in the shot. Nice mission there as he plays with one of his whiskers. And then Patrick Bonneau, the animator, came up with this little gag where he pulls on his goggles, which I always really loved. That was never something that George asked for, but the animator came up with it, and it was just so believable, and it really gave you a bit of that of the understanding of that character that he loved it as soon as he saw it. One of my personal favorite characters out of the Star Wars universe is, of course, Jabba the Hutt. And a chance to create the new Jabba the Hutt for the Phantom Menace was something that I was very happy to be a part of. We went back to the original design of Jabba, thanks to Doug Chang's drawings, which made him a little bit younger, a little bit more svelte. He's completely computer generated, and Steve Rollins did all the animation on this. He's doing all that jiggle animation by hand. That's not simulated in this case. He's actually creating shapes that allow him to jiggle that flesh around and give us that mass for Jabba's face.
I like this scene because with Jabba, because it was all constructed out of bits and pieces. The Darling women were shot at one point. Deb Fortuna was shot at another point. The set was a miniature. The guards were shot at a different point. Things about this pod race is that nothing's real. I mean, this is literally our little cast of characters on in the little pod here, but the rest is just empty desert. We did just shoot this outside so that we get a realistic effect. It had the wind and the weather and the quality that the rest of it had, but so little of this that's real. I mean, we had some pods out there on the set, but we didn't use them too much except for the pre-pod race. Once we got into the actual race part, everything's digital. In Star Wars, a scene like this would have been completely impossible, with this many extras and the vastness of this set. The complications of doing this kind of a race in a real environment, not in space, but to be able to create the environment, because you really have to have a very, very large set, or a miniature set, or in this case we were able to create it in a computer, which allows you to make it endless. In the old way of making movies, you just couldn't even think about doing something like this. You'd build a miniature set that would go on for a quarter of a mile in order to get these shots, and obviously that you just couldn't do something like that. Once I realized I had this digital power at my disposal, my first instinct how to use it was to do a race over an environment. I mean, I love speed and I love racing cars. And this is like the ultimate kid version of racing cars.
It's originally a different concept. There were two actors with appliances on their faces that were going to be then comped in. Once we got into it, realized it was going to be really difficult. So at the last moment, they were redesigned and became completely computer generated.
An exercise and be able to do a lot of things that were just completely impossible till this movie. Besides being a fun action sequence, the point to this whole exercise was this is how Qui-Gon realizes that Anakin is special. Besides the fact that he has a high midichlorian count, it shows that he has a lot of agility and a lot of skills and an ability to see things before they happen, that sort of thing.
Of course, is our arch enemy in the pod race, and we knew that from speaking to George that he was the great racer, and he was the guy who doesn't play fair, and he's the guy who knocks out all his competition. So we knew that about him in terms of his backstory. George also had him laughing the entire time. Takes great pleasure in knocking out his competitors. So we had a whole series of different laughs that we did for him.
Single task in Phantom Menace was the creation of the pod race sounds. I knew that we would have the race sequence since I was involved in its development from a storyboard through the pre-visualization process and ultimately to the editing of both the picture and sound for the sequence. I had hoped that the pod race would for the most part be a sound effects only sequence, that it would have very little dialogue and perhaps no music, and it would give me the opportunity to work with a full palette of just sound effects to create the action in the story and to control the tension, the ebb and flow of the race, and I did get that opportunity.
Here, again, like the couplers coming apart and Ben Quadnaris' car coming apart, which are, make a lot of sense if you're from Tatooine and know how all this works, but I think for some of the audience it goes right past without them being able to follow it. But like all the Star Wars films, the more you sort of see it over and over again, the more you understand what's going on. After a while, it'll make perfect sense because there is a logic to it all that's been put in there. If you know what power couplers are and how they work and what the dynamics of these racers are and all that sort of thing. Ben and I worked on the sound a lot to come up with sounds that were like real race cars, shifting gears and different sounds for different engines. Each engine has its own personality, very much like a regular Formula One or a sports car race where there's a lot of different personality in the cars just through the sounds.
I spent a deal of my recording time gathering sounds for the pod race sequence, and although I had focused in the past on aircraft and rockets, this time around George Lucas had suggested that I really record a lot of high-speed automobiles and use those sounds as the basis for the pods. And so I hadn't done a lot of automobiles in my sound design career, so I set out gathering the sounds of high-speed cars. Everything's from vintage Ferraris to Indy racers, as well as drag racers and souped-up trucks and motorcycles. I didn't restrict myself in the pod race sounds to just cars and automobiles. I recorded an electric toothbrush, which I modified into the sound of a pod racer. I synthesized some pulsing sounds for Sebulbus Racer from, originally they were the sounds of a motorboat revving, and combined them with lots of electronic sounds to build up the texture for each racer. The real challenge of the sequence came in articulating the sound, but the race itself was, for the most part, principally sound effects, and so it was a chance for the sound effects to be both the music and the dialogue in the sequence and bring to the audience all the information they needed from the soundtrack during that whole sequence. And of course, I have to say, as a sound designer, I love the sequences like that because you get a chance to really be challenged with what can you do with abstract sound. You couldn't go out and record any racers anywhere for the pods. You'd have to invent it all as you went along. Now, racers have different voices, but they had to pass through different environments where they would go through a cave. Suddenly everything could be very echoed, and then they would pop out into the open where the sound is more diffused and quiet. And whereas the pods might kind of represent the steady notes in the scene, you get the punctuation of the Tusken Raiders shooting at them, or the individual components of explosions or revs kicking in and out of the different racers. In some sense, the crowd functions as music might in this sequence because the crowd can bring with it a reaction which the listening audience will naturally pick up on.
And it was a real trick that I struggled with to say, how can an 8-year-old boy appear to be competent racing something like this? And so worked very hard to make it believable that Anakin really did have the ability, even though he was special, but that it was a believable idea that a kid this age could actually control a racing vehicle this intense. I mean, it's completely possible. There's lots of kids that are 8 and 9 years old that are dirt bike racing and go-kart racing and doing all kinds of things that are as intense as this. But you got to make the general audience believe that that's possible. And definitely frees up your imagination, because I wouldn't even allow myself to think of a scene like this before, because it would just be, impossible to do. On all levels, financial and technical, you just couldn't accomplish this. And so it's fun to be able to do something that you kind of had dreamed about over the years. But even, only in fantasy, as you're sitting writing the script, say, oh, wouldn't it be great if I could do this, wouldn't it be great if I could do that, but to finally be able to say, okay, I'm going to do it, and then see it come off as well as ILM was able to pull it off. Because, to me it looks sufficiently realistic that I believe I'm actually there.
I want to point out a mistake we made. We have one shot in here where we have Sebulba chasing Anakin, but there's no Sebulba in the cockpit. Right there. He's not actually in the cockpit, that's his headrest. But I figured we could get away with it.
Now they know.
Moment where Anakin's engine catches fire and he falls behind was greatly extended after George showed it to some friends of his. Showed the scene in rough cut to Ron Howard and a bunch of his other friends. And Ron suggested that this moment where Anakin is struggling to try and get his engine reignited should be extended so that you really feel the tension of him falling behind and hurry up, hurry up. So we got about 10 shots added after that screening.
A great job of creating an environment for these things to pass through. I mean, it's a completely digital environment. But again, it looks as photorealistic as anything I could have ever shot if I'd have gone into some canyon somewhere.
A very difficult task to work this all out for the scene. But it was really about the only option. We looked at trying to shoot helicopter plates for this in some exotic locations, but they wouldn't really be exotic enough. I mean, no place on the Earth is quite as unusual and distinctive as what George had in mind for the terrain here. Also, even if you did find a location that was suitably exotic looking, you could never really fly a helicopter fast enough to get these plates.
It's a little tricky telling the story of how these two pods get hooked together and then break apart, and what Anakin does in terms of accelerating to cut them loose, and then at the same time it sets Sebulba off balance so that he loses control of his vehicle. It's again told visually rather than logically, so you get the sense of what's going on without actually knowing how it happened.
When Sebulba crashes at the end of the film, there's a moment of silence just before everything goes haywire with his engine, and that's a deliberate moment in the soundtrack. In order to make contrast, he wanted to create a big crash and a big runaway sound of his engine. We preceded that with a moment where it's very quiet, so you'd hear it. And the idea, of course, when his pod gets banged by Anakin is that Sebulba's clutch disengages and his engine just goes up to an infinitely high RPMs and runs so high that it burns out and explodes. Therefore, the sound just rises in pitch very, very quickly. Standing to Jabba's right is his assistant and translator, Bib Fortuna, who in this case was played by none other than co-supervising sound editor Matthew Wood.
His mother congratulates and kisses him was in and out of the movie several times. I think it's ultimately a very important scene. Without it, it just didn't play very well. We needed to have closure on the event of the race, because the race was so dramatic that you sort of need to have not just him being held up on the shoulders, but you needed actually more closure on that race than what we were able to give it with that one shot. After the race with Watto is one of my favorite scenes. I just love the views and the angles and everything. Again, you gotta remember, the only person in this whole scene really is Qui-Gon, and everything else is basically manufactured. So it's basically just Liam walking around on a blue screen.
I did kind of like that moment where the probe droid flies by just as Liam steps away from facing out, so that it doesn't get a chance to see him.
Different things in the background's out of focus, but that adds texture and depth to the shot. So George will always get us to add more characters, more creatures, more droids.
Scene that we shot, we thought we'd outsmart ourselves, so we had him put his little braid on the wrong side because I was going to flop the whole thing, and then it turned out I didn't do it, so I kind of outsmarted myself.
Shot of Liam on the EOP was especially difficult to do. We needed to have some motion of it rocking back and forth when we shot the blue screen element of Liam. But then taking that and animating an EOP to move that same way under him and still have it look natural is extremely difficult.
You're kind of back to back with Annie and his mother. Well, he has to say, besides saying goodbye to 3PO, but they're really primarily about Annie and his mother, which is quite a bit of time overall for a movie like this, but the relationship between Anakin and his mother is sort of crucial to what happens later on. And I wanted to give this moment of their parting sufficient emphasis, and to understand that it was Annie's choice really to go along and become a Jedi. In the beginning here, thinking that his mother was going to come along with him, and then later realizing that she wasn't, and realizing he was going to go off on his own, and making that as difficult as possible without going overboard. I've actually, when I shot this scene, there was quite a bit more crying and carrying on, and it sort of went emotionally, I think, over the top, melodramatically from what the rest of the movies are and what the style I'd created for myself. So I toned it down a bit, kept it, the idea going there, but didn't really go for what one would say the gold of hysteria and emotional, breakdown. It just seemed like too much when we began to watch it. It seemed out of place with the rest of the movie. Part of the challenge was to make the mother loving and kind and not reject him, support him in his need to go, but understanding that his only hope for any kind of future was to go off and become a Jedi, and that he had no real chance at life living on Tatooine, and make it painful for her to see him go, but at the same time make her strong enough to support him in his decision, without her falling apart. And I have it both ways. I have some takes that are a little less emotional in this, and I have some that are way more emotional. But you get yourself into a place in a movie where if you go too emotionally, and it makes everything too important, and puts you emotionally in a place where you can't get out of in terms of the rest of the story and the believability of the rest of the story. So the challenge always in these kind of films is to keep it kind of light and not too realistic, but still have it be believable. It's kind of a theme that it reoccurs in episode 4, as I purposely develop themes and ideas and repeat them. It's very, very clear in the 2 trilogies that I'm putting the characters in pretty much the same situations, sometimes even using the same dialogue, so that the father and the son go through pretty much the same experience. Obviously, Anakin road than his son takes, so that at some of these turning points they go the other way, but it's been set up for you to almost expect that they will go, that Luke will follow in his father's footsteps, because in a lot of these episodes they do follow each other, which leads to a subtle influence which gives the audience a little expectation. And I say it's a musical idea. You have a lyrical refrain and you keep playing it over and over again in different, using different instrumentation, different octaves. It changes every time you rehear it. It's the same note played differently. I've tried to use that right from the very beginning. When I did Star Wars, I was doing that. It really came out from something I was trying to do in THX, my first film I ever did, which was, instead of 3 acts, there was almost like 3 different movies, but each movie is telling the same story in a different way. I became fascinated with that idea of, it's kind of visual jazz. It's like you go off on a riff on the same idea, and you just take the concept and you just interpret it differently visually. And there's a lot of that going on in these movies. I like the idea of cyclical motifs that keep recurring over and over and over again.
This was the very last sequence we shot in Tunisia on the very last day before we returned back for another 8 weeks of shooting at Leavesden. It was a very bittersweet day, very hot, but also a very emotional scene.
And the position here when he leaves his mother is not that much different from when Obi-Wan asks him to come along with him on his adventure. And he decides he can't do it because he has all these obligations and he doesn't want to leave his home. And even though he's very anxious to leave, from the first part of the movie, it's the same kind of conflict. In this one, he takes the road. In the one with Luke, he decides not to take the road, but the inevitability of events force him to take the road. It's sort of like fate. And it would be the same thing here. But in this case, he didn't wait for fate to push him into this. He took the road. Let's get a confrontation between a Jedi and a Sith. I wanted to be very abstract, not deal with it. So we have to, the end of the movie, the climax of the movie is the confrontation of these 2 characters. So I didn't want to give it away at this point. So I did it with a lot of swirling robes and flashing swords and kicking up a lot of dust, but not actually seeing the fight. This is really a little teaser of what we obviously are going to have at the end of the movie.
Initially, the fight was designed to have a lot of flying in it. I mean, essentially flying swordsmen. But along the way, that idea just didn't develop very well. And there was also a fight on the ramp of the spaceship as it took off over the desert. Qui-Gon jumped up to the ramp and was followed by Darth Maul. They actually fought a bit on the ramp before Qui-Gon cut the ramp, dropping Darth Maul to the desert below.
This is a little scene I toyed with over and over again, which is the introduction of Anakin to Obi-Wan. Obviously a very important moment, but I didn't want to overplay it, and I had this initial skepticism on Obi-Wan's part. Obi-Wan is not a big fan of Anakin's in this movie. That doesn't happen until later on.
One of the devices designed for Star Wars was the walking chair. This was done with the guy actually pushing it, and we had to remove all the mechanism underneath and replace this with the full computer graphic chair that was animated after the fact.
Including the marble floor. I remember you guys having to paint that, and
Right.
I still can't imagine how difficult that would have been.
Yeah, all the patterns, you notice most of the floors are actually shiny as well, which meant that we had to reproduce not only the texture of the floor, but also the reflections and shadows. It's an extremely difficult shot, the actual panning over to see Jar Jar sleeping at the table, because the wide-angle anamorphic lenses cause so much distortion that if we put him on the plate in the background scene, then his feet would slide relative to his body, because everything was distorting. So this was one of the first challenges that we had to do, where we actually had to distort the computer graphics to match the distortion in the original play. The shots where we only see his feet are actually just
Ahmed in the suit.
Ahmed in the suit.
Those are not computer generated.
And even these scenes with the Queen and the young boy had to be done with a certain amount of splits, because once again, George wanted to change some of the timings or actual positions and things. So there's a couple in here where we had to do some manipulation after the fact.
We got here two characters who are both off on a very difficult journey, both feeling very alone and comforting each other. Padme gets comfort from comforting Anakin, but it also gives her a chance to reflect a little bit on the problems she's having in terms of making decisions about what she's going to do about this situation of her people suffering. Her only hope at this point in the movie is to go to Coruscant, go to the Senate, and hope that justice will be done and her people will be freed. But I think underneath that, I've been trying to set up the fact that she's skeptical about whether this is all going to really work. I mean, she has to believe it because it's the only choice she has.
Planet completely covered by city. This was a really fun project to work on here. Trying to make something that's completely covered in buildings from orbit, but have that not look like the Death Star.
Elements of the landing Queen starship, which sound like backfiring of the engine, is in reality the cracking of the Hubbard Glacier near Yakutat, Alaska.
When we come to Coruscant, I was never able to do it before. I did it sort of in little bits and pieces, but I was never able to actually show the real city because it would have been too costly and too difficult. You know, when you're making a movie where the central action is happening on some capital planet, but you never get to go there, you only hear about it, is not a fun way to tell a story. But this way I could go right into the middle of it and see this whole aspect of the Republic, which is very crucial to the whole story, because that's what it's about, is the Emperor coming to take over, and how did a democracy turn into a dictatorship. One of our main characters, Anakin, is a little boy from Tatooine who has never been off-world, so to speak. And so I really wanted to tell this particular scene from the point of view of Anakin, about the wonder of being in this amazing environment with all these very important people that he doesn't really understand what they're talking about or what's going on. And his only friend really is Padme. So he's using her as his anchor. There's conversations going on that are sort of above his head that we don't really know what they're talking about. A very elaborate environment, very different from Tatooine. And I wanted to really get the wonder of the Republic and the government and the giant city from Anakin's point of view, because I thought that would be the most interesting way to reveal this particular environment, which is, I guess in the end, probably one of the more glorious and impossible to do if you don't have digital technology. We also decided to add on, before we had this scene where we got to see a little bit of the planet in the taxi, and in an effort to shorten the movie, we pulled it out and put it back in again, because it does give a chance to see a little bit of the environment, a little bit of the city that, a planet that is a complete city, and show it off a little bit, wonder of it all. Purposely kept Anakin sort of on the sidelines. The Gungan and the boy are always kind of, outside in the hallway somewhere. But that is the way it would be. They wouldn't be included in these kinds of meetings. They're kind of puzzled by what's going on. They're standing on the sidelines. It's a little bit a riff on the very first film, where the story is told through the point of view of the droids, who were sort of the lowliest characters. In this one, I'm doing it through primarily the two Jedi, but then the secondary characters are also carrying a lot of the weight when the Jedi aren't around, which is basically Jar Jar and Anakin. Because the central story is ultimately the Queen's dilemma and the Queen's problem of the threat to her planet and her people, and how is she going to save them.
Second thing we shot on the second day of principal photography.
If you'd been there on the day of the window, of course, it would have just been blue screen. The actors were told where they were, of course, in the script, and where they were on the planet, but I don't think they had any idea of the expanse that was going to be outside the windows. I know from speaking to them after we saw the premiere, they were blown away by just shots like this. They just go by, and the audience probably doesn't even think about them being effect shots, because we've now seen the city from so many different angles, but they're still remarkable when you look at them.
Shot, the big establishing shot, was done shooting some models of the actual towers, and then the rest was done as a digital matte painting. So they photographed the set, and then George decided later that the windows that they built with blue screen behind them were too high, so we ended up lowering the windows. That meant tracing every character who's against a window, rotoscoping them, and cutting that section out. George also wanted to make this look as real as possible in terms of photography, so we actually overexposed the background as if you're exposing for the interior. And we have lots and lots of flying vehicles outside, so we tried to create as many elements of those as possible. And each one we had to adjust the level of focus behind there, the depth of field, to relate to real life things.
Scott, tell them about the light blooming around the characters.
Well, that was the other thing with the overexposure. We wanted to get a light wrap effect around them. So we done some photographic tests, and tried to reproduce the look there. So the light actually wraps around and creates that effect as if they're in front of a real bright background.
To me, that's the subtlety in the shots that just makes it really real.
Plot-wise, we're dealing with the insistence of Obi-Wan in taking on this young kid and training him, even though it's, in theory, the child should have been trained by Yoda until he was about 7 or 8 years old. And then when he was 7 or 8, he'd be given a Jedi. He'd become the Padawan learner to a Jedi. So here we're having Qui-Gon wanting to skip the early training and jump right to taking him on as his Padawan learner, which is controversial, and ultimately the source of much of the problems that develop later on. The scene that we added later, when I cut the film together and looked at it, I needed to set up something that explained where Padme was going to be during these next few scenes, because Padme disappears, because obviously Padme is the Queen. So I needed to come up with some reason why we don't see Padme in this next series of scenes until we get back on the plane. Issues here is how Palpatine becomes Chancellor, telling how he moved to the next level, and then when you see all of the films together, it'll all make a lot more sense. But this is kind of a very small thematic issue that transcends all 6 movies, as opposed to something that's actually neatly tied up in this particular movie, although step 1 is that Palpatine becomes Chancellor, and you'll see in episode 2 that he then makes another step, and in episode 3 he makes another step. Of this scene, we really wanted to work on something that would show you that there are thousands and thousands of delegates into this government body, and that there would be some kind of unique way in which they were able to express themselves and carry on the government, but do it on a very grand scale, and came up with this sort of large stadium design with these little pods that move around inside it. which gives it a different look, but at the same time seems very functional and realistic, even though it's completely not realistic.
Chamber represented a unique sound environment. The priority sound-wise was the dialogue, because what the characters are saying is very important to understand. The sounds of the pods had to be very subdued. Most of the sounds of the pods are made out of sounds I recorded in a refrigerator. The sounds of the motor turning on and off. So it's the motor's kind of muffled deep into the bowels of the refrigerator. They were echoed, and the different pods were pitched to slightly different sounds so they wouldn't all blend together as the same noise. Just enough articulation to keep it alive and natural as if you're really there without calling a lot of attention to itself.
Entire Senate sequence, some of the difficulty here was also dealing with the blue screen around the Queen's hair and little subtleties like that. When they go in front of the white glowing bars, we had to add all of that in and had to have that, once again, light wrap. And then all the cameras flying around are computer graphics.
Along with the blue screen people, we also put in some digital characters. If you look closely at the bottom of the screen, coming up, you're going to see the ET family in one of the pods. We also added some of the other pod racers into some of the shots. There's Gascano in one, there's Rats Tyrell in another one. So if you look closely down bottom left, those are the ETs down there.
The ETs are actually in a couple of shots. We put them in one shot, and George showed it to Stephen, and Stephen said, "Oh, they're not big enough." So George had us add them to another shot.
Primary issues between this relationship between Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon is that this is establishing Obi-Wan as the kind of straight arrow, the center of the movie, and Qui-Gon as the rebel, as the one who's constantly sort of pushing the envelope, which will switch itself in the next movie when, rather than having his master be the rebel, he has his Padawan learner become the rebel. I'm using Obi-Wan as sort of this centering device through all these movies, even as we get in with Luke and everybody else later on.
So we're back inside the Jedi Palace, and once again trying to keep the same look and same tone, trying to do the color balance on all the foreground characters and make sure that the digital matte painting matched into all of that, created the same look. We also had to pay attention to which direction the camera was shooting to match the lighting and the sun in its position as well.
Doing this next trilogy and starting off with Phantom Menace gave me a chance to introduce things that are only hinted at in the later movies, 4, 5, and 6, which is the Jedi Council. How does it operate? You get to see rather just one or two fallen Jedi or half-trained Jedi or exiled Jedi. You actually get to see the Jedi in full operation, their temple that they operate out of. This was a challenge to make this all concrete and real.
This is one of our very first matte paintings of Coruscant from Yusei, and it really is spectacular. I mean, it just shows the city in such exquisite detail.
So a lot of times we rendered quite a range of different ships flying in the background. And you can also see that we have the head and tail lights and engine lights on most of the ships. And so those were added in as well. So we would make up these long loops of ships flying and add those into the specific scenes as required.
This scene was originally shot as a sunset scene, but then George decided that with the Jedi Council scene being sunset, and then the two Jedi out on the balcony being sunset, and then this scene being sunset was just too much. So we decided afterwards that we were going to make this just after the sun is set. So the whole tone of the scene went from this very warm, fiery orange sunset color to this much cooler, bluer scene.
Begins to set up the relationship between the Gungans and the Queen. It's a setup for later on when she asks the Gungans for help. It's also moving along the plot of Palpatine becoming the Chancellor. And more importantly, it's the key scene where the Queen, rather than sitting passively by and watching all this stuff transpire, takes affirmative action and decides to go back to her planet and go back to her people. I've had this written several different ways, and at the same time I have several scenes that carry this idea further in terms of her, the conflict she's having between being passive and aggressive in terms of fighting and being peaceful. Because for her, it's a break of all of her principles to go back and fight. In this scene, she doesn't really intend to go back and fight, but she does intend to go back, which will lead to a fight, and she knows that. But she's still hoping that she can resolve it in some way that doesn't involve a war. I had writing the script, and that I didn't want Anakin to become a Jedi yet, because I'm saving that for the end of the movie. But at the same time, I still had to have him tag along. And I was able to use really the device of the fact that Anakin had been put in Qui-Gon's care, and that he had promised his mother that he would take care of him, as a way of allowing them to take the boy along with him on this trek to the next, third of the movie. But one of the difficulties of writing a script with lots and lots of characters is you have to be able to rationalize why everybody is along. If you have a film like Dirty Dozen, where you sort of establish they're all going out on a mission together and you gather them all up and they go, it's pretty easy. But when you got a situation like this where there isn't any mandate that they stay together, that they're there for transitory reasons that are constantly having to be renewed as the plot progresses, it becomes much more difficult to be able to get all the characters in on the act and take them along on whatever journey you're going on.
Go with the Queen tonight.
Blade Runner, there's 2 Blade Runner spinners in the traffic stream here, but they ended up being pretty small. We didn't want them to show up too clearly. You can just barely see them. Near the beginning of Blade Runner, there was a shot where we're approaching the big police station building, and there's a Millennium Falcon that was turned into a building and placed in the skyline. So there was a Star Wars homage in Blade Runner, and so we decided to return the compliment.
This sequence was one of the very first massive blue screen sets that we had. All that existed was the ramp and this platform. It was very tough for the actors this first week to understand where they were and what they were supposed to be doing, how they were supposed to be reacting to everything around them.
We also get into this thing of what are midichlorians, how do they work, which advances a little bit of the story of the Force and how does the Force work and how do we come to know the Force, which is part of Anakin's training and learning to become a Jedi. We had to take the idea of the Force one step further. The midichlorians are kind of a side issue, not the sort of spiritual, metaphysical part of the Force, but the more practical, biological, physical part of the Force, or how we come to know the Force, which has to do really with the genetics of why some people are more tuned to the Force than others. One of the things that I'm doing in these films is to give it a little bit of reality, is to give the shots a kind of documentary feel where things float off the shot. I don't really put people in the center, and I let them sort of drift around in the frame a little bit more than you normally do in a movie. This is especially true in this scene here, as she goes up the ramp, where Jar Jar goes almost completely off the camera, and then as Anakin and R2 approach, well, Jar Jar's an animated character. I can put him wherever I want. But I purposely put him way off the side of the screen there. It just gives you the sense that it wasn't just staged perfectly for the camera, that things are kind of caught. They aren't perfect. But it actually happened. That Jar Jar was actually there. And I actually had to frame him. But I didn't, because he wasn't there.
The National Palace of Caserta in Italy is the location that we shot at for 4 days when we left England.
Another hologram shot that we photographed with the moving camera, so we tracked that camera motion in 3 dimensions and then took the photography of the character against black, rotoscoped them out and put them into that scene. Queen ship, once again, we did some manipulation too, and Rob can probably describe some of the issues dealing with Jar Jar.
Sequence like this is pretty easy for Jar Jar, as you can see, he's just standing back there, but our challenge is to not upstage the live action, which is hard when you're dealing with Jar Jar, but the reality of him being composited in behind Ewan is something we have to deal with on every shot, but make it look like they're truly in the same space together.
This is the Queen ship? Is that what this is?
Yeah, the Queen ship. Is that a model or is it?
I don't know, it's CG. So that's the Queen ship's landing, and these were shots that were also done in our very fast Sabre compositing system. We had some stills that we had of the ship, and just sort of stuck them in back there and threw them out of focus and did really quick matting with them to just sort of put it back there. And we could get these shots finaled in, just a day or so, maybe 2 days, that traditionally would have taken, a week or so to do. And they really were, it was just a great system. You saw off in the background in these shots, there was a lot of blue screen around them. I think in this case, their actors are in front of a blue screen, and we put the trees in there because they're supposed to be hiding in the woods. So these shots are sort of like nothing like they appear. Speaking of shots here with the different smoke levels, sometimes there was a lot of haze in the background, other times there wasn't as much haze.
Leads us to the Gungan hideaway. Jar Jar has swum down to the Gungan city and nobody's there. So he decides to take the Jedi off to the secret meeting place. The meeting place itself was a interesting set of shots for us animators. We needed to be able to create a whole crowd of Gungans, the Caduceus that they ride on, Boss Nass, his council, and a series of birds and creatures that are running around in the sequence. Gungan children we added in running along beside the Caduceus. We used that tree as a wipe to the big miniature that we had. Those birds flying by are Pico Picos, those are CG birds. There are Gungans in the trees, the scouts. There are children, there are mothers, there are fathers, there are animals, and of course there's Jar.
Okay, let's take a look for the stopping. Okay, other part coming soon.